Will you pray with me? O God, decrease me and increase you. What is a prophet? And how will we know when we see one? In the gospel lesson for today, Luke highlights the prophetic ministry of Jesus. In this account of Luke's gospel, the theme prophetic mission has its roots in Israel's exodus or history. Jesus steps into the role as prophet, speaking truth to power. The passage opens with the Pharisees commanding Jesus to go away. They inform Jesus that the political figure Herod Antipas wants him killed. We are unable to ascertain whether or not this warning was intended to protect Jesus or send him underground, or even if it were true. Given the tension in the political climate, Jesus disregards this warning and out of contempt refers to Herod as a sly fox, which brings us to our first clue about the characteristics of a prophet. Prophets are not intimidated by the powers that be. In speaking to these powers, prophets seek to expose the underworkings of oppression. Also found in this verse is another important characteristic, the threat of violence. Missional focus becomes the preoccupation of the one who speaks out. Jesus turns his attention to his bookings and calendar over the next days and continues to avail himself toward fulfilling the work that he was called to do. He heard rumorings that Herod was up to no good, yet he remained undeterred. Jesus knows that his days were numbered and that his mission would soon be fulfilled. The latter verses of this passage gives us a glimpse of Jesus' humanity and yet another clue of the characteristics of a prophet. Pay attention. He laments his impending sacrifice as he cries out for the other. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. In Jesus' lament, he was not reluctant, but rather deeply committed to Jerusalem. The passion Jesus exudes is one that considers our third point, that the holiness of the present encounter and a longing for a different outcome. Jesus desired Jerusalem's acceptance, but had to leave Jerusalem to her own devices because of her disobedience. Jesus stands with us as a loving parent who desires good intentions for his children, but ultimately the child has got to make the intent to heed instruction. The closing verses foreshadows Jesus' triumphal entrance into Jerusalem, ushering us towards his second coming, which takes place in our fourth point. A prophet takes action. Additional characteristics derived throughout Jesus' prophetic ministry include prophets give voice to the voiceless. Prophets take a hit without returning the hit, which suggests in many respects the sacrifice made in suffering, nonviolent action. Overall, this passage assures us that the journey with Jesus is one that models for us a prophetic imagery and is not one to be feared. We are reminded of this in the 27th Psalm. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall we be afraid? Jesus' embodiment of the prophetic posed a threat to the established order. His movement was growing in popularity, and the thought of his influence was a threat to the status quo. He calls for a new way of being, a paradigm shift, if you will, a call to renew commitment and alternative consciousness. Prophets help us connect the dots between the world as it is and the world as it could be. An additional clue about Jesus as prophet is his posture of turning matters around and right-sizing the lived experiences of a people in the margins. In verse 30, we hear Jesus calling for the great reversal where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. This call to consciousness is referenced by Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann in his book, The Prophetic Imagination, aims to motivate the church to take up the prophetic ministry of both criticizing the powers that deceive and ignore the marginalized and downtrodden, while offering a future of hope that is rooted in the promise of the God who intends freedom for all people. The church is being called to assume her power. The church can no longer be the house of the actively lethargic, people busily doing nothing. Brueggemann calls us together to reclaim a new history and to reclaim the identity of the Church of the Acts, a church full of power that is also actively engaged with this community. Our justice work must be couched in authentic engagement within the systems that bind all of us. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE, undertook a new tactic aimed at desegregating public transportation. These tactics, known as the Freedom Rides, took place on May 4th, 1961, when 7 blacks and 6 whites left Washington, D.C. on 2 public buses bound for the South. They intended to test the Supreme Court's ruling in Boynton versus Virginia, which declared segregation in interstate bus and rail stations unconstitutional. In the first few days, the riders encountered only minor hostility, but in the second week, the riders were severely beaten. Outside Anniston, Alabama, one of their buses was burned, and in Birmingham, several dozen whites attacked the riders only 2 blocks from the sheriff's office. With the intervention of the U.S. Justice Department, most of the Corps' Freedom Riders were evacuated from Birmingham, Alabama to New Orleans. John Lewis, our current congressman, was one of those seminary students that was a leader in this movement. Corps leaders decided that letting violence end the trip would send the wrong signal to the country, so they reinforced a pair of remaining riders with volunteers so the trips could continue. The group traveled from Birmingham to Montgomery without incident, but on their arrival in Montgomery, they were savagely attacked by a mob of more than 1,000 whites. The extreme violence and the indifference of local police prompted a national outcry of support for the riders, putting pressure on President Kennedy to end the violence. The riders continued to Mississippi, where they endured further brutality and jail terms, but generated and inspired dozens more freedom rides. By the end of the summer, the protests had spread to train stations and airports across the South, and in November, the Interstate Commission issued rules prohibiting segregated transportation facilities. Let the church say amen. Amen. There are many distinctive things to note about this movement, but the 2 things that stood out to me most were their strategic emphasis and use of nonviolent action to bring about change, and secondly, their commitment to a cause that was over and against the cultural norm. Dr. King even got wind of the rumors that the KKK had intended to harm these groups, but despite this warning, they moved forward. Here's the part that I like most. When asked if they knew what was at stake, one of the protesters remarked, "We have all signed our last wills and testaments last night before we left. We know someone will be killed, but we cannot let violence overcome non-violence." When we examine our history, this event calling for freedom for supposedly already emancipated people took place a century later. Again, the prophet stands between the history and current affairs of a people and speaks a word that propels us into a future reality. If not now, then when? There are many stories that parallel this one throughout our civil rights history and in other aspects of our history, and we continue to benefit and see those legacies. When I hear deeply held commitments like these of the activists and others, I'm in awe of the prophetic witness that these faithful few play in reversing history. These freedom riders challenged the establishment and didn't mind risking their lives to do so. In the 60s, the church was a viable participant in this history. Over time, we seem to have lost our power. We are sleeping at a dangerous time. A clarion call must go out to the sleeping giant found within our churches today. And I cry, awake, all ye who slumber. Return to your roots and be the power that speaks to culture. We are called to be a prophetic voice awakening within our consciousness the Imago Dei that exists within each of us. Are we prepared to welcome citizens returning to our society who enter these doors? How is our ministry to others reflected interpersonally with the other? How are we preparing our generation of children to become allies for the marginalized? How are we preparing them to respond to their faith? How are we training our community to live lives in conversation with faith? Do we know for what and whom we gather? And do we believe it? Are we training lay people to do the work of ministry, or is it left to your own interests and engagements? What is our collective voice? What is our vision? How are we educating queer communities to respond to faith in light of the tensions of the broader church? In what ways does our theology inform our sociology? And how will we make a difference? How will we be the change? I am speaking to the need for a critical mass of people of faith to revisit consciousness, to awaken, to take action, and lead out. Consciousness empowers us not to rest until justice has been accomplished. As I close, I leave with you these words shared by actor and singer Harry Belafonte at the recent 2013 NAACP Awards. And I make no apology, saints, for talking about our history, because our history goes ignored. I make no apology for holding up these stories, and it's certainly not an indictment to you, but a call for collective justice, a call for us to engage each other, a call for us to awaken to that which is of ultimate concern in our communities. So I offer that in love. Hear these words. America has the largest prison population in the world, and there are over 2 million men, women, and children who wake up incarcerated. The overwhelming majority of them are black. African Americans are the most unemployed, the most taught in the unjust system of justice. In the gun game, they are the most hunted. The rivers of blood that wash the streets of our nation flow mostly from the bodies of our black children. Yet, as the great debate emerges on the question of the gun, white America discusses the constitutional issue of ownership, while no one speaks to the consequences of our racial carnage. Where is the outraged voice of black America? We're guilty here too. Where? Why are we mute? Where are our leaders? Where are our legislators? And most embarrassingly, Belafonte asked, where is the church? In this season of Lent, let us set our feet on Jesus' path. Let us walk with him through resistance and discomfort. We will find that with Jesus as our companion, the path leads to where it's always led, to the marginalized and the disenfranchised. We are called to examine our privilege. We are called to have a role to play in our collective injustice. Where will you enter? What role will you play? Who will be the next individual to stand in the path of history to forge a new paradigm shift into a new lived reality? Frederick Douglass offers this reflection. I prayed for 20 years but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. Awake! 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 And find your place in this call to consciousness. Amen. And Ashe. I open my mouth to the Lord, and I won't turn back. I will go, I shall go, to see what the end's gonna be. I open my mouth to the Lord, and I won't to see what the end's gonna be. Now, in the spirit of getting your DNA beginning to move into action, I want to call you forth into action and just ask you to just go across and grab the hand of another and just say hi. Is that too much for us to ask? Just say hi. Someone that you don't know. I open my mouth to the Lord and I won't turn back. I will go, I shall go to see what the end's gonna be. Prophets seek to expose the underworkings of oppression. Also found in this verse is another important characteristic, the threat of violence. Missional focus becomes the preoccupation of the one who speaks out. Jesus turns his attention to his bookings and calendar over the next days and continues to avail himself toward fulfilling the work that he was called to do. We are unable to ascertain whether or not this warning was intended to protect Jesus or send him underground, or even if it were true. Given the tension in the political climate, Jesus disregards this warning and out of contempt refers to Herod as a sly fox, which brings us to our first clue about the characteristics of a prophet. Prophets are not intimidated by the powers that be. In speaking to these powers, will you pray with me? Oh God, decrease me and increase you. What is a prophet? And how will we know when we see one? In the gospel lesson for today, Luke highlights the prophetic ministry of Jesus. In this account of Luke's gospel, the theme prophetic mission has its roots in Israel's exodus or history. Jesus steps into the role as prophet, speaking truth to power. The passage opens with the Pharisees commanding Jesus to go away. They inform Jesus that the political figure Herod Antipas wants him killed. Murmurings that Herod was up to no good, yet he remained undeterred. Jesus knows that his days were numbered and that his mission would soon be fulfilled. The latter verses of this passage gives us a glimpse of Jesus' humanity and yet another clue of the characteristics of a prophet. Pay attention. He laments his impending sacrifice as he cries out for the other.